London, in the spring of 1855, hummed with anticipation as the season reached its zenith, and none felt this more keenly than Lady Eleanor Blackwood, who stood in the morning room of her family townhouse, surrounded by a whirlwind of wedding preparations. At 25, Eleanor embodied practicality and accomplishment, her chestnut hair arranged in a simple yet elegant style that complemented her intelligent hazel eyes as she meticulously reviewed the guest list for what society already whispered would be the wedding of the season. Servants bustled around her with fabric samples and flower arrangements, their movements choreographed by Eleanor's careful planning as she checked each detail against her leather-bound planning book. The spring sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating the elegant room as Eleanor paused to admire the sample of wedding cake that had just arrived, a confection of such artistry that even the kitchen maids had gasped upon its delivery. 6 months ago, when her father had announced her engagement to Alexander Westbrook, the Duke of Thornfield, Eleanor had accepted with the quiet dignity expected of a daughter of the aristocracy, understanding that the match, while arranged by their families, represented everything a woman of her standing should desire. Over the course of their courtship, a genuine respect had blossomed between them, if not the passionate love described in the novels Eleanor occasionally indulged in reading. Alexander was handsome in the classical English manner, with his tall frame and golden hair, and more importantly, he was kind and intelligent, never dismissing her opinions as many gentlemen might have done. 3 weeks, Mrs. Higgins. 3 weeks until I become the Duchess of Thornfield, Eleanor remarked to her lady maid, who was carefully pressing the lace veil that had adorned 3 generations of Blackwood brides. And what a splendid duchess you will make, miss, Mrs. Higgins replied with genuine affection, adjusting the silver hairbrush on the vanity. You have thought of everything. Eleanor smiled at this, a small surge of pride warming her chest as she reviewed her meticulous plans once more. The ceremony at St. George, followed by a lavish breakfast at Blackwood House, then the wedding journey to Italy, where Alexander had promised to show her the art and architecture she had only read about in books. Everything had been arranged with precision, from the exact shade of the bridesmaids' gowns to the selection of hymns that would echo through the church. As she sealed the final invitation with the Blackwood crest pressed into crimson wax, Eleanor felt a sense of rightness settle over her. She had done everything expected of a woman of her station, secured an advantageous match with a respected nobleman, and organized what would undoubtedly be a perfect wedding. The future stretched before her, predictable and secure, a path she had been raised from birth to walk with confidence and grace, never suspecting that in 3 short days, that carefully constructed future would shatter beyond all recognition. The afternoon sun cast dappled shadows through the ancient oaks of Thornfield Estate as Lady Eleanor Blackwood arrived for the final wedding preparations, her carriage wheels crunching on the immaculately kept gravel drive that wound its way to the imposing manor house that would soon become her home. The journey from London had been pleasant enough, with spring displaying its full glory across the countryside, but Eleanor had scarcely noticed the view, her mind occupied instead with lists and arrangements, and the 100 small details that would ensure her wedding day proceeded without flaw. Upon learning that Alexander was taking his customary afternoon walk in the gardens, Eleanor decided to seek him out, rather than waiting for him to return, wanting to discuss the last-minute changes to the seating arrangement that had been necessitated by the unexpected arrival of his elderly aunt from Bath. The gardens of Thornfield stretched in formal splendor behind the great house, a masterpiece of landscape design with geometric hedges giving way to more naturalistic plantings as one moved further from the main terrace. The late afternoon light turning everything to gold, as bees hummed drowsily among beds of fragrant flowers. Eleanor followed the path she knew Alexander preferred, one that wound through rose arbors and past the ornamental lake where swans glided with serene dignity across the still surface. The scent of blooming wisteria hung heavy in the air as she rounded the corner of a high yew hedge, intending to surprise her fiancé with her early arrival, only to find herself frozen in place, her limbs suddenly leaden, as if she had been transformed to stone by the sight before her. There, partially concealed behind a rose trellis heavy with early blooms, stood Alexander, his tall figure unmistakable even at a distance, but he was not alone. In his arms, pressed against him with unmistakable intimacy, was a slender figure in a pale blue walking dress, her golden curls tumbling free from their pins, as Alexander bent his head to kiss her with a passion Eleanor had never witnessed in him before. Even from where she stood, Eleanor could see it was Catherine, her own sister, barely 19 and the acknowledged beauty of the family, whose laughter had always filled rooms and whose presence had always somehow made Eleanor feel plain and overlooked despite her accomplishments. "My darling Catherine, these weeks of pretending have been torture," Alexander whispered, his voice carrying clearly in the still garden air. "After the wedding, we will find a way to be together, I promise you." Eleanor could not move, could not breathe, could not even blink, as she watched her sister rise on tiptoes to press her lips once more to those of the man Eleanor was to marry in exactly 21 days. Her heart seemed to stop, then shatter, each shard cutting deeper than any physical wound ever could, as the full import of what she was witnessing crashed over her like a wave, threatening to drag her under. The perfect wedding she had planned, the future she had carefully constructed, the trust she had placed in both her sister and her fiancé, all of it lay in ruins at her feet, as surely as if a physical structure had collapsed. Eleanor took one silent step backward, then another, a strange calm descending over her even as her mind screamed in betrayal and pain, her practical nature asserting itself in the midst of catastrophe, calculating and planning, even as her emotions threatened to overwhelm her completely. The couple remained oblivious to her presence, lost in their illicit embrace, as Eleanor turned and walked with measured steps back toward the house, her face a mask of composure that gave no hint of the devastation within. The heavens themselves seemed to mirror Eleanor's inner turmoil as she fled Thornfield Estate, dark clouds gathering on the horizon, and the distant rumble of thunder providing an ominous backdrop to her hasty departure. She had returned to the house with mechanical precision, instructing her lady-maid to pack only essentials, while she penned a brief note to her parents explaining that she could not proceed with the wedding, though she offered no specifics of the betrayal she had witnessed, her natural reserve and pride preventing her from committing such painful details to paper. By the time the hired coach pulled away from Thornfield, the first heavy drops of rain were beginning to fall, spattering against the windows as Eleanor sat rigid with shock, her mind replaying the scene in the garden with merciless clarity. Despite her desperate attempts to banish the images, the journey north was arduous, the weather deteriorating rapidly as they traveled, country lanes turning to mud beneath the wheels. The driver hunched against the downpour as he urged the horses forward through the gathering darkness. Inside the coach, Eleanor finally surrendered to the grief she had held at bay, tears streaming silently down her face as the physical distance from Thornfield grew, each mile carrying her further from the life she had planned, but closer to a future she could not yet imagine. Northumberland was a remote choice, but deliberate, for her maternal aunt, Lady Victoria Winters, resided there in splendid independence, a widow of substantial means, who had never remarried, and who lived largely outside the strictures of London society, managing her late husband's extensive holdings with an acumen that had doubled their value in the 15 years since his passing. It was well past midnight when the coach finally arrived at Winterhaven, Lady Victoria Country Estate nestled among the wild, windswept hills, the journey having taken nearly twice as long due to the storm that continued to rage around them. Eleanor was soaked to the skin despite her cloak as she stumbled up the steps to the imposing front door, her aunt already waiting in the entrance hall. Having been alerted by the arrival of a messenger Eleanor had dispatched from a posting-in hours earlier. "I cannot marry him, Aunt Victoria," Eleanor sobbed as the older woman enfolded her in a warm embrace, propriety forgotten in the face of such obvious distress. "Not after what I have seen. Not after what I have heard." "Shh, child," Lady Victoria soothed, guiding her sodden niece toward the blazing fire in the drawing room where hot tea and blankets awaited. "You are safe here, and tomorrow is time enough for explanations. For now, you must rest." The storm eventually subsided, both outside the thick stone walls of Winterhaven and within Eleanor herself, the violent storm of emotion giving way to a hollow numbness as she sat wrapped in blankets before the fire, finally sharing the full tale of what she had witnessed in the garden at Thornfield. Lady Victoria listened without interruption, her face growing increasingly grave, until Eleanor had exhausted her words and sat in depleted silence, staring into the dancing flames. "Sometimes, dear girl, what seems like the end is merely a painful beginning," Lady Victoria said at last, her voice gentle but firm as she took Eleanor's hand in her own. "I too once suffered a betrayal of the heart, though in different circumstances, and believed my life was finished before it had properly begun. Yet here I stand, with a life built by my own design rather than one prescribed by others' expectations." Eleanor looked up at her aunt with red-rimmed eyes, seeing for the first time not just the composed, independent woman she had always admired from a distance, but a kindred spirit who had walked through fire and emerged stronger. In that moment, as the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the windows of Winterhaven, something shifted within Eleanor, a tiny seed of resilience taking root amid the ashes of her broken dreams, too fragile yet to be called hope, but perhaps its precursor. London society thrived on scandal like desert blooms after rainfall, and news of Lady Eleanor Blackwood vanishing mere weeks before her wedding to the Duke of Thornfield spread through ballrooms and tea rooms with intoxicating speed. At Lady Harrington afternoon gathering, delicate porcelain cups clinked with studied casualness as gloved hands lifted and lowered, while eyes above fluttering fans conveyed volumes more than the polite conversation that filled the air. The Mayfair drawing rooms hummed with speculation as matrons huddled in corners, their whispers carrying just far enough to reach attentive ears while maintaining the pretense of discretion that society demanded. The official explanation, delivered with practiced gravity by Lord Blackwood at White Party, where Eleanor's absence was first officially noted, was that his eldest daughter had suffered a nervous collapse due to the strain of wedding preparations and had been sent to recuperate with relatives in the country. Lady Catherine Blackwood, resplendent in pale blue silk that perfectly complemented her golden curls and porcelain complexion, played the role of concerned sister with convincing skill, her blue eyes appropriately downcast when questioned about her sister's welfare. "Have you had word from Eleanor, Lady Catherine?" Lady Pembroke inquired over tea, her tone solicitous, though her eyes remained sharp with curiosity. "She has written briefly," Catherine replied with a delicate sigh, her performance flawless as she pressed a lace handkerchief to her eyes. "The physicians believe complete rest away from all excitement is essential to her recovery. Such a tragedy for your family, and of course for the Duke," Lady Pembroke continued, watching Catherine's face closely. "He bears it with remarkable fortitude," Catherine murmured, a slight flush colouring her cheeks that might have been attributed to sisterly concern by those unaware that she had met the Duke in the secluded alcove of Lord Whitmore Library merely hours before this very conversation. What those same observers also missed was the way Catherine gloved fingers twisted her handkerchief when the Duke name was mentioned, or how her gaze flickered toward the doorway each time a new visitor was announced, as if expecting or perhaps dreading his arrival. Meanwhile, across town at his club, Alexander Westbrook, Duke of Thornfield, endured the thinly veiled curiosity of his peers with aristocratic indifference, his golden good looks unchanged though, perhaps a certain tightness around his eyes betrayed inattention. "I must say, Thornfield, most irregular for a bride to flee so close to the wedding," remarked Lord Wellesbury after his third brandy had loosened both his tongue and his discretion. Lady Eleanor always seemed such a sensible girl, not the type for vapours or female hysterics. The Duke merely raised an eyebrow, his expression revealing nothing as he sipped his own drink with deliberate slowness. "The Blackwood family has my complete sympathy and support during this difficult time," he replied, his tone ending further discussion on the matter. Away from both their public performances, Catherine and Alexander continued their clandestine meetings, their passion now tempered by the unexpected complication of Eleanor's disappearance and the inconvenient scrutiny it had brought upon them both. "Third daughter to flee a wedding this season," remarked Lady Winfield to her companion at the opera, her voice carrying deliberately to the neighboring box, where the Blackwood family sat stiffly aware of the attention directed their way. "Perhaps there's something in the water," came the reply, followed by titters of laughter barely concealed behind ornate programs. As weeks passed with no sign of Eleanor return, speculation grew increasingly wild, with rumors ranging from a secret prior attachment to foreign elopement to more sinister theories involving the Duke's mysterious first wife who had died under circumstances never fully explained to society's satisfaction. Each whisper, each speculation, each cruelly amused glance cast toward the Blackwood family or the Duke himself added another brick to the wall. Eleanor would need to scale, should she ever choose to return to the society that now feasted so eagerly on her absence, the stakes of her eventual reappearance growing higher with each passing day as her reputation, so carefully maintained throughout her 25 years, became the casualty of her broken engagement, leaving a stain that even time might struggle to remove. 1 month passed at Winterhaven, in a fog of grief for Eleanor, days blending into nights as she moved through the spacious rooms like a ghost, taking little interest in food or company as Lady Victoria watched with patient concern, neither pushing nor withdrawing but simply remaining present until, almost imperceptibly, the worst of the storm began to pass. Spring advanced across the Northumberland countryside, painting the wild landscape with vivid greens and splashes of wildflowers that gradually drew Eleanor outdoors for longer periods each day, her complexion regaining some of its former color as she walked the extensive grounds of Winterhaven, finding solace in the rugged beauty so different from the manicured gardens of her London home. It was during one such walk that Lady Victoria approached her niece with a leather-bound ledger tucked under her arm, asking with casual deliberation if Eleanor might assist her in reviewing the quarterly accounts, a request that seemed innocuous enough, but proved to be the turning point in her recovery. The neat columns of figures provided an unexpected sanctuary for Eleanor's orderly mind, the clear logic of addition and subtraction offering a comforting contrast to the emotional chaos she had endured, and she found herself absorbed in the details of estate management with growing interest. Lady Victoria, observing this engagement, gradually shared more responsibilities, from correspondence with tenants to negotiations with local merchants, revealing through example rather than instruction how a woman might control her own affairs with intelligence and authority. "Your suggestion to rotate the northern fields rather than leaving them fallow has increased the yield by nearly 20%, Lady Victoria noted one afternoon as they sat in the estate office, sunlight streaming through tall windows onto the massive oak desk covered with maps and ledgers. Eleanor looked up in surprise, a small glow of pride warming her chest at this evidence that her ideas held practical value beyond the social accomplishments she had been raised to prioritize. "I have spent my life preparing to be someone's wife, Aunt," she admitted quietly, her fingers tracing the leather binding of the account book before her, never considering I might be capable of more. Lady Victoria smiled, the fine lines around her eyes crinkling with genuine warmth as she regarded her niece with evident satisfaction. "The greatest gift of disappointment is freedom, Eleanor," she replied, her voice gentle but firm. "The life you planned is gone. Now you may build one of your own design." This conversation lingered in Eleanor's mind as she accompanied her aunt to dinner at the neighbouring estate of Thornwood Hall the following evening, her first social engagement since fleeing London, modest though it was, with only 6 guests in total. Lord James Harrington, their host, was a widower of 30 whose reserved manner belied a keen intelligence that became evident as conversation around the dinner table turned to literature and philosophy, subjects Eleanor had always enjoyed, but rarely found opportunity to discuss in the marriage-minded circles of London society. He was not conventionally handsome like Alexander, his frame leaner and his features more angular, but there was a depth to his grey eyes that caught Eleanor's attention, particularly when he listened to her opinions on modern poetry with genuine interest rather than polite tolerance. A substantial library occupied the east wing of Thornwood Hall, and after dinner, Lord Harrington led their small party on a tour of his collection, pausing before a shelf of scientific journals that prompted Eleanor to mention an article on agricultural improvements she had recently read. "I find few people share my interest in such practical applications of science," Lord Harrington remarked, studying Eleanor with new appreciation as they discussed the merits of different irrigation systems. Most visitors prefer to admire the first editions rather than discuss their contents. As they prepared to depart later that evening, he pressed a volume of essays into Eleanor's hands, suggesting she might find them relevant to the estate improvements she had mentioned at dinner. His fingers brushed hers briefly during this exchange, a momentary contact that sent an unexpected warmth through Eleanor, followed immediately by guilt and confusion that she could feel anything at all so soon after her heartbreak. Yet, as their carriage rolled back toward Winterhaven under a canopy of stars, Eleanor found herself thinking not of Alexander's betrayal, but of Lord Harrington's thoughtful conversation, and the book of essays now resting in her lap, a small but significant shift in her emotional landscape that represented the first tentative step toward healing. Autumn transformed the Northumberland countryside into a tapestry of russet and gold, the harvest season bringing with it centuries-old traditions that Lady Victoria insisted her niece experience firsthand, despite Eleanor's initial reluctance. The village assembly rooms had been decorated with bundles of wheat and autumn flowers, their simple rustic beauty creating an atmosphere worlds away from the crystal chandeliers and gilded mouldings of London ballrooms, as Eleanor entered on her aunt's arm, wearing a gown of deep green wool, trimmed with modest lace at the collar and cuffs, rather than the elaborate silk creations that had filled her London wardrobe. Local musicians played lively country tunes on fiddle and flute, the music less refined but somehow more joyful than the orchestras of the season, and dancers moved through traditional patterns with an unself-conscious enthusiasm that made Eleanor realize how stilted and performative London balls had become in comparison. 6 months had passed since her flight from Thornfield, 6 months of quiet healing and gradual discovery as she helped her aunt manage Winterhaven and corresponded with Lord Harrington about books and agricultural improvements, their exchanges growing increasingly personal, though always maintaining proper decorum. She spotted him immediately upon arrival, his tall figure distinctive even in the crowded room, and felt an unexpected flutter in her chest when he approached with a warm smile that transformed his serious features. "I feared you might find our local festivities too provincial after London society, Lady Eleanor," he said as they exchanged greetings, his eyes taking in her simpler attire with evident appreciation. "I find them refreshingly authentic, Lord Harrington," she replied with genuine warmth, noting how the informal atmosphere seemed to have relaxed his usual reserve. Everyone participates for enjoyment rather than obligation or display. When a country dance began, he offered his hand with a slight bow, and Eleanor accepted despite her initial plan to avoid dancing altogether, finding unexpected pleasure in the lively steps and communal nature of the set that allowed brief conversations with multiple partners rather than the extended tête-à-tête of a London waltz. Between dances, they found themselves seated near a window overlooking the village green, discussing the book of essays he had lent her months earlier, their conversation flowing naturally from agricultural theory to philosophy to the nature of society itself. "Your analysis of how modern agricultural methods might address rural poverty shows remarkable insight, Lady Eleanor," Lord Harrington observed, his grey eyes intent on her face with genuine interest. "You speak as though you have thought deeply about these matters. Perhaps I needed to lose everything to discover my own mind, Lord Harrington," she replied softly, surprising herself with her candour. "Before coming to Winterhaven, my thoughts were always directed towards suitable accomplishments and suitable conversation for a suitable match, never toward questions of substance or purpose." His expression grew thoughtful as he studied her face in the warm glow of candlelight. "Then perhaps what appeared to be misfortune was actually opportunity in disguise," he suggested, his voice lowered for her ears alone. "Had you married the Duke, would you have discovered your talent for estate management or your passion for improving tenant conditions? Or would those capabilities have remained buried beneath the weight of duchessly obligations?" Eleanor had never considered this perspective, but found herself nodding slowly as the truth of his words resonated within her. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine that her escape from a marriage built on betrayal might have saved her from a lifetime of limitation, rather than depriving her of position and security. As the evening continued, Eleanor found herself laughing more freely than she had in months, perhaps years. The weight of societal expectations temporarily lifted from her shoulders in this community that judged her by her present actions rather than her past misfortunes. When Lord Harrington's hand accidentally brushed hers during a particularly spirited discussion about modern literature, neither of them immediately withdrew, the brief contact sending a current of awareness through Eleanor that was both thrilling and terrifying, for it confirmed what she had been reluctant to acknowledge, that her heart, which she had believed permanently damaged, was somehow healing enough to respond to this man whose mind and principles increasingly commanded her respect. Winter descended upon Winterhaven with characteristic severity, blanketing the estate in pristine white snow that transformed the landscape into a silent wonderland, while confining its inhabitants largely indoors, where roaring fires and thick stone walls provided sanctuary against the biting northern winds. Eleanor had grown to love these quiet days spent in the library or estate office, her confidence in managing various aspects of Winterhaven increasing under her aunt's thoughtful guidance, while evenings often brought Lord Harrington for dinner and literary discussions that stretched late into the night as their intellectual connection deepened into something Eleanor was hesitant to name, but could no longer deny. It was on one such snow-muffled morning that the letter arrived, the familiar Blackwood crest on the seal causing Eleanor's heart to stutter painfully before she gathered the courage to break the wax and unfold the heavy cream paper. The elegant handwriting belonged to Catherine, the familiar loops and flourishes now seeming as false as the sentiments they conveyed, announcing her engagement to the Duke of Thornfield and requesting, with breathtaking audacity, both Eleanor blessing and her presence at the wedding set for spring in London. The pages trembled in Eleanor's hands as she read her sister words of hollow remorse and transparent justification, culminating in the assertion that family bonds should transcend all disappointments, as though Eleanor's discovery of their betrayal had been merely an inconvenience rather than a devastation. Lord Harrington found her still seated in the library that afternoon, the letter crumpled in her lap, and her face a mask of composure that failed to hide the storm in her eyes. She shared the contents without preamble, her voice steady despite the turmoil evident in her rigid posture and tightly clasped hands. "I must return to London," she concluded, her gaze fixed on the snow falling beyond the window. "I cannot hide in Northumberland forever, allowing them to craft whatever narrative suits them while I am absent to defend myself." "Some battles must be faced alone, Lady Eleanor," he replied gently, moving to stand beside her chair. "But no, you do not return to London without allies." His steady presence and quiet support broke through the careful composure Eleanor had maintained. Tears she had refused to shed over the letter, now spilling silently down her cheeks as she acknowledged the truth she had been avoiding. Returning to London meant not only confronting her family and former fiancé, but also leaving behind the sanctuary of Winterhaven and the man whose companionship had become essential to her healing. "James," she whispered, using his given name for the first time, "I cannot deny that you have come to mean a great deal to me, but I have built walls to protect what remains of my heart and cannot promise they will ever come down completely." His hand found hers, warm and steady, as his grey eyes held her gaze with unwavering certainty. "I would rather have a portion of your true self than the entirety of someone pretending, Eleanor," he replied simply. The sincerity in his voice left no room for doubt, and Eleanor felt something shift within her, a cautious unfurling of possibility where before there had been only closed doors. Lady Victoria entered to find them thus, hands clasped and gazes locked in silent communication that required no words, and she smiled with quiet satisfaction before clearing her throat to announce tea was served. As they moved toward the drawing room, Eleanor's mind was already turning toward the journey ahead, recognizing that she would return to London a different woman than the one who had fled 6 months earlier, no longer defined by her role as daughter or prospective bride, but as a woman discovering her own capabilities and worth. Whatever awaited her in London, whatever confrontation loomed with Catherine and Alexander, she would face it not as the devastated woman who had fled Thornfield Estate, but as someone who had begun to build a life of her own design, with allies who valued her true self and the growing conviction that what had once seemed like an ending had in fact been the painful but necessary beginning of a journey toward authentic happiness. Spring had returned to London by the time Eleanor's carriage rolled through the familiar streets of Mayfair toward the Blackwood townhouse. The fashionable thoroughfares lined with trees in fresh leaf and window boxes bright with early blooms. Yet she viewed the once familiar landscape through eyes transformed by her months in Northumberland. The elegant simplicity of her travelling costume, a deep blue wool tailored with precision rather than ostentation, reflected the changes within as much as without, her posture straight but relaxed rather than rigidly proper as it had once been, her chestnut hair arranged in a style that prioritized practicality over fashion, yet somehow framed her face to better advantage than the elaborate constructions she had once favored. 9 months had passed since her flight from Thornfield, 9 months of self-discovery and quiet growth, and though her heart still quickened with apprehension as the carriage approached her childhood home, there was a newfound steadiness in her spirit that had been absent when she left. The butler, who opened the door, barely concealed his shock at her appearance, clearly having expected the same Lady Eleanor who had departed nearly a year ago rather than the composed woman who now handed him her gloves with a quiet authority reminiscent of Lady Victoria. Her parents awaited her in the drawing-room, her mother rising in a rustle of expensive silk while her father remained seated, his face a mask of controlled displeasure, as Eleanor entered, and made her curtsies with perfect correctness despite the tension vibrating in the air. "You have caused this family considerable embarrassment, Eleanor," Lord Blackwood began without preamble, his tone that of a judge addressing a defendant. "Your inexplicable behavior forced us to create explanations that society barely accepted, and now you return without warning just as your sister prepares for her wedding to the man you abandoned." Eleanor met her father's gaze without flinching, noting with detached interest how the opulent surroundings that had once impressed her now seemed excessive and somehow hollow, the gilt and crystal chandeliers speaking more of display than comfort or taste. "I did not abandon the Duke, father," she replied evenly. "I removed myself from a situation that had become untenable upon discovering his intimate relationship with Catherine." Lady Blackwood gasped at this directness, her hand fluttering to her throat in genuine shock, while Lord Blackwood's face darkened with anger. "Such accusations are unbecoming and unsubstantiated," he declared, his voice rising slightly. "The Duke has generously agreed to overlook your erratic behavior and has formed an attachment to your sister that is both proper and advantageous to this family." That night, Eleanor found Catherine waiting in her bedchamber, her golden beauty unchanged, though her blue eyes held a wariness that had not been present before. "I hoped you might be happy for me, Eleanor," she began, her tone modulating between contrition and defiance. "Alexander and I could not help falling in love. Surely you understand that some emotions cannot be denied." Eleanor regarded her sister with a clarity that would have been impossible 9 months earlier, seeing not just the beautiful face that had captivated Alexander, but the insecurity and selfishness beneath it. "This was never about love, Catherine," she replied quietly. "It was about winning, about taking something simply because it belonged to someone else. I hope the prize proves worth the cost." The following morning brought Alexander himself to call, his golden good looks somewhat diminished by the wariness in his expression as he faced the woman he had betrayed. "You were always so competent, so composed, Eleanor," he said after initial pleasantries had been exchanged, his tone suggesting this observation explained his behavior. "I never looked beneath the surface to discover the woman you truly were until you were gone, and by then it was too late." Eleanor studied him with a detachment that would have been impossible before her time at Winterhaven, recognizing in his words not genuine remorse but the wounded pride of a man unused to rejection. Seeing clearly now what she had been blinded to before, that his character lacked the depth and integrity she had attributed to him, based on superficial charm and position. "And now you never shall," she replied simply, her voice neither bitter nor angry but matter of fact, the statement not a punishment but merely an acknowledgement of truth. She left him standing in the drawing-room as she went to attend to correspondence, letters from Lady Victoria and Lord Harrington that connected her to the authentic life she had begun to build in Northumberland, reminding her that her return to London was temporary. a necessary confrontation with her past that would free her to move forward rather than a permanent return to a world whose shallow values and performative relationships she had outgrown during her absence. The Duchess of Pembroke annual spring ball represented the pinnacle of the London season, an event where attendance was both a privilege and a statement of social standing. The magnificent ballroom, gleaming with countless candles reflected in gilt mirrors, as the cream of society gathered in their finest attire to see and be seen among their peers. Eleanor entered on her farther arm, her gown a creation of deep emerald silk, whose elegant simplicity stood in marked contrast to the elaborately trimmed and bejeweled ensembles surrounding her, the quiet confidence in her bearing drawing curious glances and whispers as she moved through the crowd with composed dignity. The past week had been a gauntlet of carefully orchestrated social appearances designed to reintroduce her to society and normalize her presence at Catherine's upcoming wedding, each encounter requiring Eleanor to maintain perfect composure in the face of thinly veiled curiosity and occasionally malicious speculation about her absence and return. The orchestra had just begun the opening strains of the first dance when a ripple of surprise moved through the assembled guests, heads turning toward the entrance where Lord James Harrington stood surveying the room with calm assurance, despite the fact that he rarely attended London events, preferring the intellectual pursuits and quieter pleasures of country life to the artificial gaiety of the season. His eyes found Eleanor immediately, and he moved through the crowd with purpose, bowing formally before her, with perfect correctness that nonetheless conveyed a warmth apparent to all who observed them. "Lady Eleanor," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the momentary hush that had fallen around them, "would you do me the honor of this dance?" The public nature of this request, made before Eleanor had danced with any other gentleman since her return, constituted a clear statement of support and regard that sent immediate ripples of speculation through the ballroom as she placed her hand in his with a genuine smile that transformed her features. From across the room, Alexander watched their progress onto the dance floor, his expression darkening as he observed the easy conversation flowing between Eleanor and Lord Harrington, the relaxed grace with which she moved in his arms, so different from the controlled propriety she had always maintained during their courtship. Catherine stood nearby, her attention noticeably divided between her fiancé and the handsome young Viscount Weatherby, whose admiring glances she encouraged with subtle flirtation despite her recent engagement, unaware that Alexander had noticed this divided attention with increasing frequency in recent weeks. As the evening progressed, Eleanor found herself surrounded by a small but growing circle of guests who seemed to respond to her newfound authenticity, the conversation flowing more naturally than it ever had during her previous seasons as she spoke with quiet authority on topics from estate management to literature, her intelligence no longer carefully concealed beneath a veneer of appropriate feminine accomplishments. "I chose wrongly," Alexander murmured as he approached her during a brief moment when she stood alone near the terrace doors, his voice low enough that only she could hear the admission. "I see that now." Eleanor regarded him calmly, noting with detached interest that his words stirred no emotional response within her beyond mild pity for the man who had only recognized value when it was irretrievably lost. "You did not choose wrongly, Alexander," she replied, her voice gentle but firm. "You simply were not worthy of the choice." Before he could respond, a commotion near the refreshment table drew their attention, where Catherine's voice had risen sharply in argument with Viscount Weatherby, her cheeks flushed with anger, rather than becoming modesty as she berated him for dancing twice with Lady Sarah, despite earlier promises made to her during private moments in the conservatory. The indiscreet outburst confirmed what Eleanor had already observed throughout the evening, that Catherine's flirtations extended well beyond propriety despite her engagement, her need for admiration and conquest unchanged by her apparent victory in securing the Duke. Lord Harrington appeared at Eleanor's side as Alexander moved swiftly to contain the unfolding scene, his presence a steady comfort as they observed the whispers spreading through the ballroom like ripples in a pond. "Some treasures are recognized only by those who value substance over appearance, Lady Eleanor," he said quietly, his grey eyes holding hers with an intensity that conveyed far more than his measured words. "With your permission, I should like to call upon you tomorrow to discuss certain matters of importance regarding our mutual futures." The declaration, made with characteristic directness yet perfect propriety, brought a warmth to Eleanor's cheeks and a lightness to her heart that had been absent for so long she had almost forgotten its possibility. As the ball continued around them, Eleanor felt the final pieces of her past falling away, replaced by the prospect of a future built on genuine connection and mutual respect rather than social expectation, with a man who valued her mind and spirit rather than merely her pedigree or accomplishments. The public vindication of her choices completed, not through dramatic confrontation, but through the simple evidence of authentic happiness that no amount of gossip or disapproval could diminish.